I suppose there are moments in every life when a single sentence changes everything. Not a dramatic line from a movie, but a quiet, almost ordinary sentence spoken in a dull office. For me, it was uttered by the man I had dedicated 20 years of my life to, the man whose company I helped build from a tiny, hopeful startup into a recognizable brand. He looked at me, not with malice, but with a strange, cold indifference, and said, "Robert, your services are no longer aligned with the company's forward-looking structure." He fired me, just like that. And the cruel irony, he did it to make room for her, his new mistress, a woman young enough to be his daughter, whom he intended to install as the director of new initiatives. It hurt, yes, but the real pain wasn't in the loss of the job or the money. It was in the sudden, shattering realization that for 2 decades, I hadn't been a trusted colleague or a friend. I had just been a tool, an easily discarded piece of office furniture. I smiled, though. I didn't cry. I just gave him a gentle nod, picked up my old briefcase, and walked out. I walked out of that skyscraper and into the bright, indifferent afternoon sun, and that day I wasn't just unemployed, I became invisible. My name is Robert. For 20 years I was the quiet engine room of Sterling & Co., the one who fixed the broken deals, wrote the proposals, and stayed late to make sure the presentation was perfect. I wasn't the face on the magazine cover, I was the hand that held the pen. I loved that job. It gave my life purpose, a daily rhythm, and it provided for my wife, Eleanor, and our 2 children. We weren't rich, but we were comfortable, secure. My boss, Mr. Sterling, let's call him David, we started together. He was the ambitious visionary, the charming talker. I was the reliable doer, the one who worried about the balance sheets. We had shared dreams, late-night pizzas, and the kind of camaraderie that only comes from fighting for a common goal, or so I thought. Over the last 2 years, things had shifted. David became distant, his conversations clipped. He started taking long, unexplained trips and wearing new, expensive suits that didn't quite suit his old, comfortable self. I saw the changes, but I blamed the stress of the business. I was loyal to a fault. I didn't see the signs. I didn't want to. It's funny how loyalty can blind you to the simplest, most human betrayals. The turning point wasn't the firing itself, but the utter lack of apology or explanation, the total erasure of our shared history. He offered me a small severance, a final, impersonal transaction that said, "You meant nothing." The hardest part of the walk home was trying to formulate the words to tell Eleanor. She knew how much of myself I had poured into that company. She was expecting me to come home, perhaps tired, but successful, ready for our usual quiet dinner. I decided to wait. I couldn't shatter her world the moment I stepped through the door. I needed to process the shock myself. I spent an hour sitting in the park, watching children play, the noise of their laughter a strange contrast to the hollow silence inside me. It was then that a quiet strength began to settle. It wasn't the strength of anger, but the cold, hard clarity of a man who has nothing left to lose. David had taken my job, yes, and my security, but he hadn't taken my mind or my knowledge. He had given me a gift, an unwanted freedom, and a clear view of his true character. That evening, I told Eleanor gently over a dinner of simple roast chicken. I left out the part about the mistress. That was his small, sad secret, not mine to share and frankly, irrelevant to the core issue. I simply said the company was going in a new, younger direction and my role was eliminated. She was shocked, of course, but her reaction wasn't what I expected. She didn't panic. She just reached across the table, took my hand and said, "Robert, you've worked so hard. We'll be fine. We have each other." That moment, that quiet, unfaltering support was the real turning point for me. It transformed the humiliation into a deep, burning resolve. I realized the only thing that had been truly aligned with Sterling and Coase, forward-looking structure was David's ego. And I knew, standing in my own comfortable kitchen, that my true value wasn't tied to his company's letterhead. The job market in my field was tough, and I was 55, past the age where new companies are eager to hire. But I had my 20 years of uncredited success, my quiet strength, and a leaner's belief. David Sterling thought he had cut me down, but all he had done was plant a seed of something entirely new. I was done being the invisible engine room. It was time to build a structure of my own. I went to bed that night, not as a victim, but as a man who had just quietly closed one door, ready to face whatever came next with a calm heart and a plan that was beginning to form in the silence. The world outside might have seen a man who was fired, but I saw a man who had finally been set free. The next morning, the reality of unemployment settled in, not as a crisis, but as a vast, empty space that needed filling. I didn't rush to update my resume or frantically call old contacts. David Sterling had taught me a profound lesson: never put your entire faith and future into someone else's fragile ego. My initial plan was simple: stay quiet, live frugally, and observe. I told a leaner I was taking a short consulting break, a white lie to protect her from the worry of seeing me constantly rejected by the youth-obsessed job market. The truth was, I wasn't going back to work for anyone else. The 20 years I spent solving David's problems had given me a unique, almost proprietary knowledge of the industry's weak spots, the places where companies were bleeding money because they lacked the kind of meticulous, honest oversight I provided. David's mistake wasn't just firing me, it was assuming that the knowledge I held belonged to him, stored neatly in his company files. It was stored right here, in my memory, and it was entirely mine. I started the quiet rebuilding in our small, rarely used den. I pulled out my old notebooks, not the official company records, but my personal journals where I had tracked every major project, every hidden cost, and every successful strategy I had ever implemented. I had always been meticulous. It was a compulsion that David had benefited from but never truly appreciated. I spent the first few weeks structuring my knowledge. I was building a consulting framework, specializing in forensic operational analysis, a fancy term for finding hidden inefficiency and saving companies massive amounts of money quickly. I knew the market needed it. Small and medium-sized businesses couldn't afford a large, expensive consulting firm, yet they were often the ones suffering the most from internal clutter. I offered precision, not prestige. The challenge was marketing myself without revealing my connection to Sterling, and I didn't want the stench of David's casual cruelty to taint my new venture. So I created a new professional identity. I called my company Argus, after the Greek figure known for his 100 eyes, a symbol of vigilant, comprehensive sight. I decided I wouldn't seek clients aggressively. I would wait, relying on the quality of my first few projects to generate word of mouth. This quiet, slow-burn approach was the opposite of David's loud, aggressive marketing style, and it felt right. The first client came through an old acquaintance, a man named George who ran a regional manufacturing firm. George didn't know I was fired, he just knew I was available and had a reputation for getting things done. He was skeptical of my low initial fee, which was designed to remove any risk for him. I told him plainly, "George, you only pay the full rate if I save you 5 times that amount in the first 6 months." It was a risk, but it showed utter confidence. For George's company, I wasn't just doing consulting, I was performing a rescue. I spent 10 days simply observing, listening to the factory floor managers, and digging through the obscure corners of the supply chain budget. What I found was a simple but deeply ingrained error in their material purchasing process, costing them 6 figures annually. I presented my findings clearly, without judgment or complexity. George was stunned. He implemented my changes immediately. Within 3 months, his savings exceeded my wildest promises. He paid my full fee, plus a generous bonus, and then he did the most crucial thing for Argus Consulting. He called 2 of his equally struggling, yet deeply connected, industry friends. The secret success was the sweetest revenge, though I tried hard not to frame it that way. It was a quiet confirmation that my worth was independent of David's approval. Eleanor noticed the change in me. I was still focused, but the chronic stress I used to carry, the stress of being permanently on call for David's emergencies, was gone. I was working harder, yes, but for myself, on my own terms. I kept the financial details vague with her, only assuring her that we were more than stable. My true earnings were being funneled into a long-term investment account, a silent, secret foundation of security that David Sterling had tried to destroy, but had inadvertently forced me to build stronger. The humiliation I felt on that day he fired me had become the fuel for my quiet rebellion. Every successful client meeting, every dollar saved for a small business owner, was a small, satisfying victory against the belief that only the loud, aggressive egos succeed. I was building a reputation based on results and integrity, things that David Sterling had long since traded for cheap thrills and fleeting youthful validation. I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that our paths would cross again. The industry wasn't that big, and the kind of mistakes David was making, letting his personal life bleed into his professional judgment, were the kind of mistakes that created precisely the kind of problems Argus Consulting was designed to fix. I wasn't waiting for a spectacular act of revenge. I was simply waiting for the inevitable consequences of his choices to catch up to him. I just had to be ready, quiet, and strong, like a shadow patiently waiting for the sun to set. A year passed, and the quiet success of Argus Consulting was no longer a secret, at least not in the small, specialized world of operational finance. I hadn't advertised once. Every new client was a referral, a testament to the simple fact that when you consistently deliver integrity and tangible results, people talk. I had moved from the small den to a spare room above a small bookstore, a silent, unassuming office far from the downtown skyscrapers where men like David Sterling held court. My clients were loyal, grateful, and most importantly, honest. I had achieved the kind of financial independence that David, despite his flashy company, probably didn't truly possess, burdened as he was by image, debt, and the need to constantly impress. My victory wasn't loud. It was the quiet confidence of knowing my bank account was secure and my integrity was intact. Eleanor started volunteering at a local charity, enjoying the newfound freedom from worrying about my high-stress corporate life. I finally told her the whole truth about Argus Consulting, the scale of its success, the growing waiting list of clients, and the fact that I was truly the owner and only employee. I still hadn't told her about the Mistress. That detail felt too petty, too much like gossip, and I wanted her focus to be on our future, not David's failures. She cried a little when I showed her the balance sheet, not tears of fear but of pride. "You built this, Robert," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "All by yourself. They never gave you credit, but you took it anyway." Her validation meant more than any corner office ever could. My life was solid, built on a foundation of careful work and mutual respect, which were the very things David Sterling had actively discarded. Then the whispers started. In our industry, bad news travels faster than good news, especially when it concerns a large, publicly visible firm. David Sterling's company, Sterling & Co., had been coasting on its reputation for a long time, held together by the foundational structures I had put in place. But with me gone, and David more focused on image and his new director of new initiatives, the mistress who was utterly unqualified for the role, the engine room was failing. The first whisper came from George, my first client. He mentioned over coffee that Sterling & Co. had just lost a major long-term government contract, a contract I personally had negotiated and managed for 10 years. George looked grim. "They say the proposal was full of holes, Robert, basic errors, like the company lost its mind." I just nodded, sipping my coffee. I didn't gloat, and I didn't share my previous affiliation. But inside, I felt a deep, cool certainty. The errors were basic because the person who always checked the basics, who always stayed until 2 a.m. to triple verify the numbers, was gone. The whispers grew louder. Another client, a former colleague from a competing firm, called me specifically to ask if I knew what was happening at Sterling & Co. He mentioned a severe drop in stock value and rumors of a massive, failed acquisition attempt that had cost the company millions. "They're in chaos, Robert. Pure chaos," he said. "David Sterling is blaming everyone but himself. They say his new director is constantly undermining the veterans and pushing half-baked ideas." It was the natural consequence of arrogance and misplaced priorities. David had prioritized momentary gratification over long-term stability. He had replaced competence with compliance, and now the cracks were showing, widening into chasms. I felt no satisfaction in his personal pain, only a detached professional interest in the inevitable fallout. I understood the mechanics of his failure better than anyone. I knew where the real vulnerabilities lay. The proprietary software structure, the complex international supply chain protocols, the very systems I had painstakingly managed. I never intended revenge in the traditional sense, never wished bankruptcy or ruin upon him. My revenge was simply my quiet, soaring success, a silent daily refutation of his belief that I was disposable. Yet, as the news of Sterling & Co.'s instability spread, I realized fate was offering something far more poetic than I could have engineered. I knew, based on the severity of the financial hits, that David would eventually have to make drastic, panicked moves. He would need a savior, an outside firm to come in and assess the damage, a surgical team to find the cancer he was desperately ignoring, and who, in this small, interconnected industry, specialized in forensic operational analysis, with a guaranteed track record of saving troubled businesses. Argus Consulting. The thought sent a peculiar shiver down my spine. It wasn't the thrill of potential confrontation, but the eerie sense of a circle closing, an invisible, inevitable force drawing us back together. I went home that night and looked at my old, worn briefcase, the one I had carried out of his office a year ago. It wasn't just a container for my papers anymore. It was a trophy of my quiet resilience, and soon, I suspected, it would be the vessel carrying my final, most silent judgment back into David Sterling's world. I was ready to face him, not with anger, but with the calm, devastating clarity of competence. The professional world has a funny way of ensuring that every action has an equal and opposite reaction. David Sterling's reaction to his mounting company failures was not self-reflection, but sheer panic. The stock continued to plummet, major clients were exiting, and the director of new initiatives, the very reason I was fired, had proven spectacularly ineffective, her youth and charm unable to compensate for a total lack of financial acumen. Sterling & Co. needed serious help, and they needed it quickly. I knew this because the news was now a steady stream, not whispers. Financial reporters were openly questioning David's leadership, mentioning the sudden, unexplained departure of several long-term key personnel, a coded reference to me and others he had alienated. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon. It wasn't David, of course. It was Amelia Thompson, the interim chief financial officer of Sterling & Co. A woman I respected, someone who had always been marginalized by David's inner circle. Her voice, usually sharp and confident, was tight with strain. "Robert," she said, without preamble, "I know who you are and I know what you do. We are in a crisis. The board has mandated an emergency, independent operational review. They need a deep forensic analysis, and they need it yesterday. Robert, no one else has the reputation for discretion and speed that Argus Consulting has right now." I listened, my heart surprisingly steady. There was no triumph, just a cold, professional understanding of the gravity of her request. I knew this was coming. "Amelia," I replied, keeping my voice level, "I appreciate the confidence. I have a long waiting list of current clients, but for a project of this scale, I can make an exception. However, I have strict protocols. I only work directly with the board and the CFO. I must have full, unfettered access to all financial and operational data, and there can be absolutely no interference from—" I paused, letting the silence hang where David's name should have been. "From senior management." Amelia understood. "Done," she said, her voice a rush of relief. "We are desperate, Robert. You will be the sole external analyst appointed by the board to report on organizational efficiency and identify areas for immediate restructuring." The irony was breathtaking. David Sterling's panic had led his own board to hire the one person capable of exposing his deepest errors, the one man he had ruthlessly discarded. I arrived at Sterling & Co. 3 days later. I didn't enter through the executive lobby. I used the consultant entrance, a gesture of quiet professionalism that ensured I wouldn't run into David accidentally. Amelia met me and handled the formalities swiftly. The atmosphere in the building was thick with fear and confusion, the stench of corporate failure. I was given a small, sterile office far from the executive suite. I had not yet seen David, and I intended to keep it that way until my report was finished. I spent the next 2 weeks burying myself in the data, the exact same data I had helped generate for 20 years. But now I saw the destructive patterns, the unnecessary layers of management created to house David's favored, unqualified acquaintances, the disastrous, unvetted investments pushed through by the director of new initiatives, and the shocking erosion of the foundational protocols I had established. It wasn't just incompetence, it was neglect fueled by hubris. The actual twist wasn't seeing him. It was the piece of paper that landed on my desk on my final analysis day. Amelia brought a stack of files for personnel restructuring recommendations. She sighed, placing the top file in front of me. "The board asked me to gather the resumes of the senior executives David is planning to lay off in the next wave of cost savings. They want your professional opinion on the merit of his choices." I nodded, opening the folder to maintain my professional composure. The first resume was that of a dedicated manager who had worked for Sterling & Co. for 15 years. I reviewed it quickly, adding a note that his department was vital. The second was a mid-level manager. Then came the third. It was David Sterling's own resume, prepared by his HR department for an executive efficiency review, required by the board as part of their assessment of management bloat. It was dated just last month. I didn't need to read the content. I had written or edited most of the accomplishments listed there over the last 2 decades. but I looked at the section labeled Core Competencies, and the irony settled over me, heavy and cold. The man who had fired me, the man who had judged my entire career irrelevant, had inadvertently put his own professional future in my hands. David Sterling didn't know Argus Consulting was run by Robert. He only knew the board had hired a highly recommended, secretive firm. He thought I was just another anonymous, objective analyst. I picked up my pen. I wouldn't be cruel. I wouldn't use my authority to exact personal revenge. I would simply be honest. I was reviewing the resume, not of my betrayer, but of a failed executive whose actions had fundamentally damaged a major enterprise. I wrote my recommendation, based on data analysis showing a fundamental disregard for established operational protocols, resulting in catastrophic financial loss and systemic failure. I recommend a comprehensive change in senior leadership. It was professional, detached, and utterly devastating. I closed the folder. The quiet strength I had found in the park a year ago was now complete. I had achieved the most profound revenge possible, the one that required no anger, no shouting, and no personal confrontation, only the cold, hard proof of superior competence. I delivered the final Argus Consulting report to Amelia Thompson, the CFO, the next day. It was a document of over 200 pages, meticulously detailing the systemic failures, financial hemorrhaging, and most damningly, the negligence at the highest levels of Sterling and. My recommendation regarding David Sterling's leadership was clear, concise, and entirely based on the objective financial realities his own decisions had created. There was no mention of our history, no hint of the personal betrayal. It was the purest form of professional accountability. Amelia thanked me quietly, her face drawn with exhaustion. She didn't have to ask about David, the data spoke for itself. My work was done. I collected my significant fee, a true reward for 2 decades of deferred credit, and I walked away from the skyscraper for the second and final time. The immediate aftermath was silence. For several weeks, I focused entirely on my established Argus clients, diving back into the comfortable routine of honest work and measurable results. I didn't watch the news or seek out articles about Sterling and Co. I didn't need to. I knew the wheels were turning, and in the corporate world, those wheels grind slowly but crushingly. Eleanor and I took a small, overdue vacation to the coast, spending quiet days walking on the beach. It was a deliberate effort to wash away the lingering stress and the faint, bitter taste of corporate politics. I needed to remind myself that my life was now defined by this peace, not by the drama I had just exited. The confrontation with the past had occurred, not in a shouting match, but in the solitude of my temporary office, over a cold financial document. That was my closure. The real-life twists, however, are rarely tidy. 3 months later, I was back in my quiet office above the bookstore when an envelope arrived. It wasn't business mail. It was a simple, thick, cream-colored invitation. It was for a major industry awards dinner, the kind of black-tie event David Sterling used to drag me to, where he took all the credit for my work. I was nominated for the first time in my career for the Outstanding Contribution to Financial Efficiency Award, recognizing the exceptional turnaround work Argus Consulting had achieved for several small manufacturers. I knew George, my first client, and Amelia, the CFO, had been instrumental in the nomination. Eleanor insisted we go. "This isn't about him, Robert," she said firmly. "This is about you. You earned this spotlight." The night of the dinner was overwhelming. It was the first time I had stepped back into that glittering, high-stakes corporate environment since I was fired. People I hadn't seen in years approached me, offering sincere congratulations on my retirement and subsequent massive consulting success. They knew now who the real genius behind Sterling and Co.'s early success had been. David Sterling was a ghost in the room. His company, I learned through polite industry chatter, was undergoing a massive, painful restructuring led by an emergency management team. David himself had been transitioned out of the CEO role and was now a special advisor to the board, a title that meant absolutely nothing. He was still technically employed, but his power was gone, his humiliation public. Then I saw him, David Sterling. He was standing near the bar, nursing a drink, looking pale and noticeably aged. His signature arrogance had been replaced by a thin, desperate veneer of dignity. He was alone. The young director of new initiatives was nowhere to be seen. She had been the first high-profile casualty of the restructuring. Our eyes met across the crowded room. It wasn't a sudden, dramatic moment. It was slow, quiet, and unavoidable. He saw me, saw a leaner beside me, and saw the genuine respect in the eyes of the people I was talking to. He knew I was the man who wrote the report. He knew. He walked toward me slowly. I didn't brace myself for a fight or a plea, I just stood still, meeting his gaze calmly. When he reached me, he didn't apologize for firing me or for the betrayal or for the mistress. He simply looked at me, his eyes full of a strange mixture of defeat and lingering resentment. He leaned in and spoke in a low voice, almost a whisper, "Robert, I see you've done well for yourself. I always said you had talent." It was a final, desperate attempt to reclaim some ownership, to imply that my success was somehow traceable back to his initial discovery of me. I looked him straight in the eye, offering no bitterness, only a quiet, final truth. "David," I said, my voice soft but steady, "I have done well because I stopped working for you. I built a company based on the values you decided to discard." And then I simply smiled, the same small, calm smile I had given him the day he fired me. I turned back to Alina and my new colleagues, leaving him standing there in the middle of the crowded room, his forced dignity utterly shattered by the quiet weight of my words. He didn't try to speak again. He just turned, walked back to the bar, and disappeared into the shadows. That was my revenge, not his ruin, but my peace. I won the award that night. And as I held the heavy trophy, I knew the real prize was the freedom and integrity that allowed me to earn it on my own terms. Life, after that night at the awards dinner, settled into a deep, abiding rhythm of quiet satisfaction. David Sterling faded entirely from my reality, becoming less a villain and more a cautionary tale. Sterling and Co. eventually stabilized under new leadership, but it never recaptured its old swagger. The entire dramatic episode taught me that the biggest difference between success and failure often isn't talent, it's integrity and focus. David lost both when he decided that momentary ego was worth sacrificing 2 decades of loyal foundation. I gained both back the moment I walked out that door. Alina and I sold our house a year later, moving out of the city and into a smaller, cozier home near the water. The move wasn't a necessity. Argus Consulting was thriving, bringing in more than enough income for us to live comfortably anywhere. It was a choice, a conscious, deliberate decision to downsize the distractions and upsize the joy. We traded the long commutes and the endless noise for quiet mornings and the smell of salt air. I continued to run Argus, but I limited my client load to just 4 companies at a time. I valued my time now more than my revenue, a shift in perspective that the corporate world could never understand. I never became a loud, visible personality. I declined interviews and turned down offers to sell Argus to larger firms. My success remained quiet, a private affirmation of my competence. This quietness was the true measure of my peace. I didn't need external validation. The proof was in the stable businesses I helped save, the grateful calls from the employees whose jobs I protected, and the consistent growth of my own debt-free company. That was the secret success David tried to erase, the inherent value of meticulous, invisible work. There was one final, small moment of closure, entirely unintended. A few years later, my daughter, Sarah, a brilliant young lawyer, called me. She was volunteering for a community outreach program helping people navigate complex job applications and resume writing. "Dad," she said, sounding slightly exasperated, "I have this one client. He's trying to transition back into the corporate world, but his resume is a mess. Huge gap after he left his old company, and his accomplishments are inflated. I can't verify half of them." I listened patiently, offering advice on how to frame career transitions positively. "He needs a total rewrite," I told her. "Focus on transferable skills and honesty." She sighed. "It's tough. He seems so defeated, Dad. His name is David Sterling. I think he used to be a CEO." Hearing his name again, after all that time, didn't trigger anger or glee. It triggered a deep, unexpected wave of empathy. I realized that my humiliation had forced me to find true strength and a new path, while his humiliation, the loss of his power and status, had simply left him adrift and defeated. He had nothing left to fall back on because he had never invested in anything but his own image. His mistress was gone, his company was gone, and now he was reduced to needing free community help to fix a resume full of lies. I took a deep breath. "Sarah," I told her, my voice steady, "tell your client to stop focusing on the big, empty titles. Tell him to focus on one small, honest thing he did well and build from there. And tell him that the best revenge in life is simply doing good work." I didn't tell her who David Sterling was to me. It didn't matter. The circle was complete, not with a flourish of revenge, but with an unexpected act of quiet professional charity. The review of his life, not his company, delivered through my daughter. I often reflect on that period of my life. The betrayal hurt, but the subsequent peace healed. David Sterling tried to destroy me and only succeeded in setting me free. That is the lesson I carry forward. The moment you stop seeking approval from those who don't see your worth, you unlock your own true power. My success wasn't the millions I earned or the award I won. My success was the ability to sit on my porch every morning, drinking coffee with the woman I love, completely secure, knowing that my greatest revenge was simply living a good, honest life, far removed from the cold shadows of the skyscraper. The weight of that peace is the only weight I ever want to carry. It's often said that ambition is the fuel of success. For 20 years, I believed that. I believed in the collective ambition I shared with David, the fierce drive to make Sterling and Co. the best. But in the quiet of my retirement, I've learned that ambition isn't just fuel. It's also a powerful, corrosive solvent if it isn't tempered by humility and ethics. Looking back at that old photograph, I see two men with bright hopes. One of us built his ambition into a legacy. The other let his ambition burn his life down, consuming everything, including the people who mattered most. My life post-David became intentionally smaller, deliberately manageable. I didn't need 100 employees, constant travel, or the stress of quarterly reports. I needed simplicity. That necessity, the immediate need for security after being fired, was what paradoxically led to my greatest wealth, the wealth of time. David, I realized, was never chasing money. He was chasing validation, a constant need for others to acknowledge his importance. That need forced him to inflate his company, take reckless risks, and ultimately, prioritize the fleeting approval of others over the solid, quiet truth of his balance sheets. He made the biggest mistake in business. He confused reputation with reality. My early days with Argus Consulting were defined by meticulousness, a quality David had once prized but later dismissed. My process was simple. I analyzed, I simplified, and I stabilized. I helped small business owners sleep at night. That felt like real work, tangible and good. The sheer volume of waste I found in even small companies was staggering, and it always came down to the same human failures: miscommunication, ego-driven decisions, or the sheer refusal to admit something wasn't working. The greatest failure I documented, however, was David's. In the Argus report, I showed that the millions lost weren't due to market shifts. They were due to his personal mismanagement and the disastrous hearing of his mistress, who spent company money on vanity projects that yielded no return. It was heartbreakingly amateurish. I often wonder if David ever felt true regret, not for the failure of his company, but for the fundamental betrayal of trust. Did he ever spare a thought for the long nights I pulled to cover his mistakes, or the genuine friendship I believed we shared? Probably not. People like David, consumed by external image, struggle to access true internal introspection. He likely viewed me, even years later, as an unfortunate obstacle, a necessary casualty of his forward-looking structure. That realization, that he didn't even acknowledge the human cost, was the final cut, but also the final liberation. I stopped expecting humanity from a machine of ambition. The biggest difference between us wasn't our skill set, it was our definition of success. David sought the high mountain peak, the view from the top, regardless of the treacherous climb or the people he pushed off the path. I sought a wide, stable plateau, a place where the footing was sure, the air was clean, and I could build something lasting without constantly looking over my shoulder. His success was brittle, tied entirely to market perception. Mine was resilient, tied only to my own competence and the satisfaction of my small, loyal clientele. The financial security Argus provided gave me the ultimate freedom, the ability to walk away, to say no to stressful, low-value work, and to spend time on things that genuinely nourish the spirit. I took up woodworking, creating things with my hands that were beautiful and solid, the opposite of the intangible, often hollow, deals I used to arrange. Every finished piece of furniture, every smooth piece of sanded wood, was a quiet victory over the abstract chaos of my former corporate life. This tactile, tangible work grounded me completely. My last interaction with David, through my daughter, confirmed everything. He was still trying to appear successful, grasping at past glories. He needed me indirectly to fix the narrative of his life, just as he needed me to fix the balance sheets of his company. The advice I gave him to seek honesty and build from small, true achievements was the path I had been forced onto, the path that saved me. I hoped, perhaps foolishly, that he might finally take it. But ultimately, my peace was not dependent on his redemption. It was dependent on my acceptance that some people simply cannot change. The final, quiet success was knowing that I had escaped the true cost of his ambition, which was not wealth, but the loss of his own soul. Betrayal, even a professional one, shakes the foundation of a marriage. It's not just the financial threat, it's the emotional echo. David's actions made me question 20 years of my own judgment, my loyalty, and my understanding of the professional world. And when you doubt yourself, that uncertainty inevitably bleeds into the people closest to you. The months following my firing were less about job hunting and more about subtle reassurance, reassuring Alina that I was still the man she married, still capable, and still worthy of her trust. Her unwavering support was the bedrock of my quiet rebuilding. Eleanor's reaction, when I finally told her the whole truth about David and the mistress, was typical of her profound character. She didn't react with shock or fury, but with a quiet, settling sadness for David. "He must be so unhappy, Robert," she said, shaking her head. "No happy man acts like that." Her empathy stripped the situation of its drama, reducing David's betrayal from a corporate attack to a personal tragedy. That reframing was incredibly liberating for me. It allowed me to see the revenge not as an act of destruction, but as an act of personal preservation and self-respect. The most important aspect of my success with Argus Consulting wasn't the money, it was the recovery of my time and my presence. When I worked for David, I was physically present at home, but my mind was always 100 miles away, tethered to the office by the constant anxiety of David's impulsive demands. I missed countless dinners, school plays, and simple moments because the siren call of corporate ambition, driven by David's insecurity, was always louder. Now, the connection with my adult children, Sarah and Thomas, deepened significantly. Thomas, who works in software development, found a new mentor in me. We used to only talk about surface things. Now, he often calls to discuss business ethics, how to navigate office politics, and the value of professional autonomy. I saw him wrestling with his own version of corporate ambition, trying to reconcile his desire to succeed with his desire to remain a good, balanced human being. I never pushed him toward the Argus path, but I shared the lesson: never let your career define your character, and never let anyone else own your time. My experience became a practical guide for him, not just a sad story. Sarah, the lawyer who unknowingly reviewed David's resume, took a profound lesson from the indirect encounter. She asked me later, after I finally shared the full, incredible story, why I didn't try to ruin him, why I simply offered professional, albeit devastating, advice. I explained that ruin is fleeting, but peace is permanent. David ruined himself, Sarah, I told her. My job was simply to document the reality. True justice doesn't require hatred, it just requires honesty. That concept, the quiet strength of honesty, became a cornerstone of her ethical practice. My small circle of friends, mostly former colleagues who had suffered their own quiet indignities under David's leadership, drew strength from my example. They saw that leaving the glittering corporate stage wasn't a failure. It could be an elevation. I wasn't just consulting. I was proof that there was a viable, fulfilling life after the corporate burnout, a life where competence was rewarded directly, not filtered through layers of politics and favoritism. My success became a silent, empowering narrative for those feeling trapped in their own gilded cages. The most profound change was in how I viewed wealth. We were secure, comfortable, and we were able to help our children start their own lives without the crushing burden of debt. But the true wealth lay in the unburdened quietness of my mind. I no longer woke up with the pit of anxiety in my stomach, dreading the next unexpected disaster David would create. I woke up with a sense of control and purpose. That shift, from reactive anxiety to proactive peace, was the greatest yield of Argus Consulting. I look at the old briefcase sometimes, the one that carried my final report into Sterling & Co. and my severance papers out. It sits now in my closet, dusty but respected. It symbolizes the end of a chapter marked by loyalty and subsequent betrayal, and the beginning of a foundation built entirely on my own terms. The ultimate lesson wasn't about revenge on David Sterling, it was about loyalty to myself. And that loyalty, to my values, my family, and my peace, is the strongest, most unbreakable foundation a man can ever build. The shift from being a corporate engine room to an independent consultant brought a surprising new role into my life, that of an unintentional mentor. Young professionals, often referred to me by Thomas or Sarah, would seek advice, not just on finance or operations, but on the bigger questions: how to maintain ethics in a cutthroat environment, how to handle toxic leadership, and how to define a career that was both ambitious and humane. They were looking for the map I had to draw for myself after David set fire to my old one. I started a small, informal weekly discussion group, meeting at the local library, a world away from the glass towers. My advice was always the same simple principle: never confuse your job with your worth. I shared my experience, without naming names, of dedicating 2 decades to building someone else's image only to be discarded. I explained that the true, lasting power in business is held by those who possess unique, essential knowledge and integrity, not by those who have the loudest titles. That was the core of Argus Consulting's philosophy, and it was the strongest shield against corporate betrayal. My influence extended beyond these young, hopeful faces. Through my consulting work, I began to see subtle shifts in the corporate behavior of the mid-sized companies I advised. I didn't just fix financial models, I fixed organizational culture. When I found corruption or chronic, ego-driven incompetence, I insisted on its swift and transparent removal. I used the power of my external, objective review to enforce the kind of honesty David Sterling had actively suppressed. My reputation was now less about saving money and more about demanding accountability. I often contrasted the two styles of leadership: the David Sterling model, which sought obedience and spectacle, and the model I championed, which sought competence and sustainability. David's model created constant internal fear, which led to cover-ups and bad data, the very root of Sterling and Co.'s collapse. My model created trust, encouraging employees to flag problems early, knowing they would be fixed, not punished. It was a quieter, slower path to growth, but the results were exponentially more stable. I felt, in a strange, satisfying way, that I was cleaning up the industry, one small business at a time, undoing the very kind of damage David's management style inflicted. One afternoon, a young woman named Clara, a financial analyst struggling with a deeply unethical boss, came to me. She was terrified of speaking up, fearing retaliation that would ruin her budding career. She was considering quitting without a word, letting the injustice stand. I didn't tell her what to do, but I shared the lesson of the resume review. I explained that silence is not protection, it's complicity. I showed her how to document her concerns meticulously and objectively, focusing only on the financial risks and ethical breaches, not personal feelings. Your power, I told her, is in the data, Clara. Your courage is in your quiet accuracy. Clara took the advice. She presented her evidence to a non-executive director. Her boss was investigated and quickly removed. Clara, who expected to be sidelined, was instead promoted and given the authority to implement the ethical controls she designed. She was a small victory, but to me, she was a profound success. She represented the antithesis of the toxic culture I had left behind. She was becoming the kind of quiet, effective leader who understood that a company's integrity is its greatest asset. I occasionally receive industry newsletters and know that David Sterling is truly gone from the public sphere. His name is now only mentioned in footnotes discussing failed executive tenures. His absence is as loud as his presence once was. It's not satisfaction I feel, but a sense of closure. He made his choice, and I made mine. His path led to professional oblivion and personal desperation, while mine led to a fulfilling, independent life built on the very principles he scorned. My mentoring and consulting became a legacy far more valuable than any corner office I might have occupied at Sterling, and I was now building a foundation of ethical competence within the next generation, ensuring that future Roberts wouldn't be as easily discarded. This influence, subtle yet seismic, was my final, ultimate victory. I was no longer the invisible man. I was the quiet anchor of the ethical current in my small corner of the corporate world, helping others avoid the very reefs where David Sterling's ship finally ran aground. Years have passed since I first walked out of David Sterling's office, clutching my worn leather briefcase. That day, I felt humiliated, reduced to nothing. Today, I understand that it wasn't the end of my story, it was the essential, painful prelude to my true life. Humiliation has a strange power. It can crush you, or it can forge you into something much harder and more resilient. I chose the latter. The revenge I eventually achieved wasn't a planned act. It was the inevitable byproduct of choosing integrity over image and competence over political maneuvering. The secret to the success of Argus Consulting was rooted entirely in David Sterling's failure to recognize my worth. He saw me as replaceable. I proved I was indispensable. The irony is that my ability to build my own thriving business relied on the very knowledge and skills I perfected while serving him. I learned the systems, I perfected the protocols, and I mapped out the weaknesses of the entire corporate structure. When he cast me out, he simply handed me the blueprint for his competitor. That was the core of the quiet victory. He equipped his enemy out of sheer arrogance. My life now is a constant, gentle reminder of the difference between temporary gain and lasting value. David sought the quick returns, the flashy headlines, and the young company he brought in to replace me, led by his mistress, crashed and burned because it chased vanity metrics instead of stability. My work, by contrast, was about deep, infrastructural health. I often tell my mentees, don't look for the applause, look for the foundation. If the foundation is solid, the applause will come, slowly and authentically. Eleanor often reminds me that the firing was a gift in disguise. It took away my security, but it gave me back my soul. Before, I was a high-paid prisoner of David's anxiety. Now, I am the owner of my own time, my own success, and my own peace. We built a life together that is centered on shared experience, not shared stress. Our financial security is no longer an abstract number on a corporate ledger. It is the concrete comfort of knowing we are independent of external whims. That shift, from anxiety-driven success to peace-driven stability, is the ultimate lesson of the whole story. The confrontation at the awards dinner and the subsequent, indirect review of David's resume were not acts of cruelty. They were acts of necessary detachment. I realized that David was no longer my betrayer. He was simply a consequence of his own poor choices. My final professional verdict on his resume was, in essence, the final verdict on his career, lacking in fundamental structural integrity. By remaining purely professional, I denied him the opportunity to drag me into his personal drama and taint my victory with bitterness. That discipline was harder than any financial analysis I ever conducted. Today, my ambition is directed inward. I focus on mastery, not volume. I focus on cultivating genuine relationships, not transactional ones. I see the young professionals I mentor making conscious, ethical choices, and I know that the cycle of corporate cynicism can be broken one quiet decision at a time. The real revenge wasn't seeing David fall, it was realizing that I no longer needed to look back at all. If there is one final moral to my story, it is this: your true worth is not determined by the titles you hold or the person who employs you, but by the integrity you maintain when everything around you is falling apart. David Sterling taught me, through his betrayal, that the power of a single, skilled, ethical person is immense and cannot be contained by any contract or corporate hierarchy. He tried to discard me like a broken tool. I went out and built a whole new, better workshop. I often stand at the water's edge, watching the waves come in, and I think of that day I was fired. The fear is long gone, replaced by a profound sense of gratitude. Thank you, David Sterling, for firing me. Thank you for your arrogance, your betrayal, and your ultimate indifference. Because of you, I learned the invaluable lesson: the greatest success is the one you build for yourself, brick by quiet, honest brick, utterly independent of the judgment of others. And the weight of that peace, that true success, is heavier and more enduring than any gold trophy or corner office could ever be. My story ends here, not with a bang, but with a deep, satisfying quietness.